Chapter 8, the Jefferson Era. Section 4, the War of 1812. As we learned in the last section, Congress declared war on Great Britain for many reasons. We talked about in the last section, impressment, the British aiding of Native Americans, and so Congress declared war. So we're going to start with some of the early battles of this War of 1812. Britain had hundreds of ships, but they were scattered all over the world. And the Americans had less than 20 ships, but they had new ships like the USS Constitution, which you see right there. And American ships are really good in one-on-one battles. And that's kind of how many of these sea battles took place, is because, again, most of the British ships are spread out all over the place. So it was easier for American Navy to defeat the British Navy in one-on-one battles. However, because of those one-on-one attacks, the British will eventually set up a blockade of American seaports. As you see on this map here, you can see how all these ships are surrounding the United States here to blockade them. Now remember, one of the reasons why the Warhawks wanted to go to war was to invade Canada, capture it, and add more land to the United States. So that's what they still want to do. They want to invade Canada, and so they start doing that in 1812. Many of those early battles, though, were not victorious. 3 planned attacks from Detroit, Niagara Falls, and the Hudson River Valley all failed. The attack on Detroit failed when British soldiers and Indians, led by Tecumseh, captured Fort Detroit. The other American attacks also failed when state militia troops refused to cross the Canadian border. So the plans to invade Canada failed and ended. Now, another key goal was to capture the Lake Erie because Britain had control of that. So the United States will send the Navy, and in charge of that particular branch of the Navy was Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. He took a small fleet, sailed out into the Lake Erie, and went into battle with the British. The battle ended when the British surrendered, and Perry won the battle for them. And that drove the British out of the northwestern part of the United States. War erupted in the South with Native Americans, like the Creek Indians, and you will see the beginning of something called the Creek War, which is kind of tied in with the War of 1812. The Creeks were tired of white settlers moving onto their lands. The Creeks will attack a fort in Alabama called Fort Mims, and they killed up to 250 U.S. defenders of that fort. In response to this, the commander of the Tennessee militia was a guy named Andrew Jackson, who you see right here. Andrew Jackson was sent in with 2,000 volunteers and to attack the Creeks, and they will meet in a battle called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, and they won the battle, meaning Jackson. And so a treaty was signed called the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ended the Creek War and forced the Creeks to give up millions of acres of their land. So if you look at this map here, this reddish-orange area were Creek lands that they gave up to the United States. Though the United States was having success on the western and southern frontiers, they weren't doing so well on the eastern part of the country. The British sent more troops over to America after defeating the French, and their first goal was to attack the capital of the United States, which is Washington, D.C., in 1814. And they set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and other important government buildings in Washington, D.C. In fact, during that battle, you will see a sitting president actually fighting in a battle, and that was James Madison. He went outside the White House and started fighting the British, while his wife, Dolly Madison, was collecting all the valuables of the White House to move them, including a portrait of George Washington. The British will also shell a fort called Fort McHenry, which is now known as Baltimore, Maryland, and still the Americans refused to surrender, and so the British retreated. During this battle of Fort McHenry, this is where a young man named Francis Scott Key, a writer and a poet, was on a British boat, and watched the battle and saw that the American flag was still flying after the battle was over, and he wrote a long poem called The Star-Spangled Banner, which is now our national anthem. Oh, say, can you see? Now the British will be moving toward New Orleans in the hopes of capturing the city and controlling the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson commanded the U.S. forces in New Orleans with a mixture of all sorts of soldiers: regular soldiers, African Americans, Choctaw Indians, militia, and even pirates. The battle began on January 8th, 1815, with the British outnumbering the Americans, as was the case with all the battles. The British, however, were caught in open field while the Americans were in trenches or behind barriers. And because the Americans were covered, they were able to pretty much wipe out the British unit of 2,000 soldiers. And this was a huge victory for Andrew Jackson. It was an American victory called the Battle of New Orleans, and it made Jackson a national hero. And it was the last major conflict of the war, and more interestingly, it happened 2 weeks after the war was officially done with a treaty. So news of the treaty never got to Andrew Jackson and the British, and so they fought a battle that the Americans, of course, won. But the war had actually ended 2 weeks before that. Now, during the course of the war, there was a group of New England Federalists who, obviously, like we talked before, were opposed to war, and they agreed at a convention called the Hartford Convention that they were going to secede from the Union, meaning leave the Union, in opposition of the war. And as these delegates from the Hartford Convention went to Congress to go talk to them about it, the war had ended. And so that kind of burst the bubble of the Federalists, and they actually lost a lot of power after this war because of their kind of failure of implementing this plan of secession. The Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812, with each nation returning conquered territory. The consequences included feelings of patriotism among Americans, power of many Native American tribes broken, lack of goods during blockade boosted American manufacturing. That is the end of section 4.